My name is Justin Ennis. I'm the Executive Director of After School Activity Partnerships. I'm also part of the leadership team of the Greater Philadelphia Extracurricular Collaborative, also known as GPEC. I'm joined by some other folks here today on the leadership team. I saw Beth Stein earlier. And it's my job to just welcome you all to this wonderful event. And it is so great to have a room full of out-of-school time folks and also our school-based behavioral health providers. There is a lot about today's event that excites me, and having had the fortune to have seen Dr. Ginwright do his presentation and talk to other folks about his work at the Children First Next Big Thing Summit, there really is a lot of meaningful work that he has led that is very adaptable and important to the work of out-of-school time folks across the city. So I just want to pull out a couple things that have really fired me up about today's session. The first thing is that really his work will challenge us in the ways that we approach what we do with children as professionals and empower us to be more impactful champions for our children and their dreams, to borrow a phrase from Dr. Ginwright, to strengthen the roots of well-being in the children we serve. But I'm also excited about what this convening affirms. One thing the pandemic time is that we in this room are already aware of is that out-of-school time folks are at the vanguard of children well-being and helping children and families in our city address and overcome the many individual and systemic issues that threaten their future. We are an ecosystem of caring individuals whose professional lived experiences represent an enormous reservoir of value to the youth that we serve. But we often don't have the access to the level of professional development or resources to match the scope and depth of the needs that we encounter. So I'm grateful to Children First in the school district for recognizing with this event that with the proper resources and training, our city's out-of-school time system can be a driving force for student well-being, student ambition, and collective healing. On the second part, which has really resonated with me about Dr. G's work, if I can say Dr. G, is that so many folks in our workforce need healing as well. And I think at the broader scale of education, the out-of-school time workforce is much more representative of the communities that it serves. And I think today, we need to start creating space for that important work. And today is just the beginning of building our capacity to implement Dr. G's work. So thank you again to Children First and to the school district for taking leadership to make sure we all work together at the same table to help kids. And I specifically want to thank Karen Lynch, who is here today, but also Dr. James Banks for pulling this together along with out-of-school time folks alongside school-based behavioral health providers who are allied with us in this important work. So thank you again, all of us, for joining, all of you for joining us. And it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Deputy Chief of Prevention, Intervention, and Trauma at the district, Dr. James Banks.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Can you hear me? Yes. Good morning. All right. First of all, this view, this is our first time in this space, so I'm like, I love it. So, my team is very excited about this. We've been planning this for a while. Give me my. All right. So we're here today for a couple of reasons. One is to hear from Dr. Ginwright, and two is we're going to start something today. Okay. And actually, no, it was started before. Christy's planted, right? But I really want to engage in something. But first, let's hear from Dr. Ginwright, and then I'll go into what we're going to do. So Dr. Ginwright is one of the nation's leaders and innovators and thought leaders on African American leaders. Reading, guys, I hate reading. Youth activism, youth development. So he's a professor currently at Sam. He can talk about himself. We're not going to do it. He's amazing, and we know he's amazing. Right? And he's talking about how we help our youth and our families in a way in which is real. Okay? And the only way that we can also help our youth and help our families is if we're also helping our staff help themselves. Right? And so the reason why we're doing this today, and we'll be doing this in the future, is so that we can do this work in a non-collaborative way. Everyone has to come to the table with good intent, right? With good reason, good effort, but we all have our own kind of perspective. And I'm hoping that we can have a through line that's consistent, not just in the district, not just in the organization, but a through line that we're using some of the same language, right? Some of the same goggles with how we are helping our students, how we're helping our youth, how we're helping our families, okay? And so, as I've been working with this team for the last, I was counting this morning, it's been 8-9 months, which is crazy to me. It's been a co-creation of something that's amazing, okay? And this amazingness, I'm making words here, is not just about what's going to happen inside the walls of our schools. It has to extend outside the walls. And we're going to start inside the walls. In order to do that, we need to have all the people. It's not just my district folks. You guys are in the walls. And so I want to make sure you understand what we're doing, because I need you to be a part of what we're doing. And not just us on the sidelines, or I think there's something going on there. I want you to be a part of this. And then, as you reach outside the school buildings, as your reach is even further in mind sometimes, right? Then we can really affect change in a way in which we know the change needs to happen. All right, that was much better than you read. So with that said, I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to hand it to Dr.
Thank you so much, Dr. Banks, and it is such an honor to be here. All the community partners, the school district of Philadelphia, I am humbled, I'm honored to be here. This is supposed to be a brown bag, and a brown bag is more informal, so I'm going to be a little bit more informal, but I also want to make sure you have really what you need to support young people who are really struggling with issues connected to behavioral health. I am, as I said, just humbled and honored to share these ideas with you. We all know that young people, not only in Philadelphia, but around the country, are facing the most significant mental health crisis of our time. And many of us, I believe, are coming up with really good solutions to the wrong problem. And what I hope you leave with today is 3 things. One, with a sense of hope and inspiration about what you need to do personally. Not your organization, not your curriculum, but you. What you need to do as an adult who cares and loves our babies. The second thing I hope you leave with is a sense of direction about ways in which you can improve the delivery of your service in ways that have deep meaning for not just the reduction of symptoms for young people, but the aspirations of well-being so that they can actually achieve the dreams that they deserve. So I hope you leave with some of that. And third, I hope you leave with a vision about the possible work that will happen here in Philadelphia. We are all in an ecosystem. Young people do not live, work, and play just in school, neither in our out-of-school time programs. They live in an ecosystem. And so I hope you leave with a common set of language, a set of strategies that can align about how we all are supporting young people. Now that's a lot I hope you leave with in the time here, but that is my aspiration. So I want to start with, I always start with, can you all hear me? This good? All right. So I always like to start with a story about my life, right? I'm a professor, but at heart, I'm a youth development professional. I cut my teeth working with young people, African American youth, first in San Diego, California, and then in Oakland, California. And at the time, and I'm kind of going off the topic right here, so just y'all, I feel like I'm at home. So if I'm a little too informal, I'll get back to the lecture. I cut my teeth working with young people in San Diego and then Oakland, California, and I created a camp called Oakland, Sovereign and Independent Nation of Oakland, California. A camp called Camp Akili. And at the time, this was even before the concept of youth development. And so at the time, we had to call ourselves violence prevention, even though we weren't really doing violence prevention. We had to get funding, though. So we called it violence prevention. Y'all know what I'm talking about. What do you mean, right? Well, we had to talk about the pathology of young people and how we were reducing their drug use. And we had to talk about the things that we weren't actually doing, y'all. And so the camp was really about the transformation of young people and their healing. But we didn't have the language for it. We didn't, the professional development that I went through, I didn't have the language for it. And so in my journey as a professor and as a researcher, I wanted to develop the language for me so that I could actually call attention to, one, the crisis that young people are facing, but also the solution that I thought is rooted in the work that I was doing in Oakland. And so these ideas really come from 30 years of work with families, with children, with young people, with police, with youth development professionals, with principals, really trying my best to articulate both the challenge but also the solution, or a solution, facing young people. So here's the story. This is a story about my mama. And my mama grew up in the South, a place called Trenton, Florida, right outside of Gainesville. And I grew up in Southern California. And as a child, my mother would always tell us these magical stories about how she grew up in Florida. And she used to always tell me and my brothers about this magical little house that she grew up in, where she used to climb the tree and pick mangoes. And she used to tell me about these little flies that glowed in the dark. And my brothers and I, growing up in Southern California, we had never seen flies that glow in the dark flies, right? And so we were just amazed about this little house my mother had always told us about as children. About 6 years ago, my mother, her brother passed away, and she was going to the funeral in Trenton, Florida. And y'all know how mamas are. My mama called me up. She said, "Shawn, I want you to come to the funeral." I'm like, "Mom, I got papers to grade. I got midterms. I can't come." She said, "Boy, you better get your butt on the plane and get to Florida." And so and secretly, I didn't want to go see that little house that my mother had always talked about. And so I went to Florida, and Mama, she's so proud. So we go to my cousin's house, and we sit on the couch with plastic covers. And she's, here's my son, the doctor, and we're doing the whole thing. But deep inside, I wanted to see that magical little house that my mother grew up in. And so towards the end of the day, I was like, "Mom, it's hot. Can we just go see the house?" She said, "It's near here." She said, "Sure." And so we walked down the street, and we took a left on a dirt road. And I don't know if you've ever been to the South, but when you're on they have these trees that canopy the roads, and the trees drip these moss, and it's just beautiful and enchanting. And so we walked in silence. And the sun was setting, and as we walked down the road, sure enough, I could see these little lightning bugs start to glow, and I was getting excited like a child. And we got closer to the house, and finally we got to this magical little house. And I was so excited to see it. And when she turned, my mom turned and said, "Here we are at the house." I was like, "Well, where's the house?" And when she turned, this is what I saw. Actually wasn't a house at all. And when I first saw the house, I almost started to cry. Because it was the very first time I realized the level of poverty my mama had grown up in. I didn't know she grew up poor. I mean, I knew she grew up in the South, but this level of poverty, I had no idea. And as I was struggling to, deal with my own emotions, my mama started smiling. She was so happy, like a child in Disneyland. She was all happy, and she took my hand, and we walked into this little house, this little shack really. And she was just excited. This is where there was a little mark on the floor, a circle. She said, this is where we used to keep the number 10 tub. I'm like, what's a number? Y'all don't know what a number, I didn't know what a number 10 tub was. She said, it's a tub where this is where we used to bathe, right? Because we didn't have running water. And she showed me where the stove was. And she just went through every nook and cranny of that little one-room house with a sense of joy. And I was so like moved out. And she could tell, my mama, she could tell I was almost crying. And she said something to me I'll never forget. She took my hand and she said, boy, what's wrong with you? She was looking up at me. I said, Mama, I didn't know you grew up so poor. I mean, you told us about this magical house where where you would do all these things. I didn't know it was a shack. And she said, baby, don't you know that in this house when I was a child, I dreamed of you before you even existed. And that one day that you would be able to come back here to see the origins of my dream. So don't be sad, right? Be happy, be rejoiceful. And then I was like, wow, right? As I left, I realized that my mama understood poverty, but she wasn't defined by it. That she understood marginalization, but she wasn't defined by it. And that it was her dream of me before I even existed that allowed me to experience that. I believe that we all have that capacity, right? And how are we taking the capacity for us to dream beyond the conditions that we're in? How is it that we are cultivating the ability to see beyond the conditions that young people are in? How are we creating strategies and opportunities and spaces for young people to dream beyond the conditions that they're in? And so, for me, that was healing. And I hope that this process that we call healing-centered engagement is a way that we can begin to reconcile some of the challenges that we have before us. The first thing I think is important in our thinking about healing is harm. And I think that most of my own training and thinking about harm has been somewhat misdirected. That is, I've learned about trauma and harm through a medical model. As a graduate student, I learned that trauma impacts an individual, that trauma is episodic, that trauma can be treated, right? And that all of these things are the conditions that young people need to be supported with. I was in my graduate class, and we really began to interrogate how are we thinking about the issues that harm young people. And as we began to talk about it, my graduate students who work in neighborhoods where there's high violence, one of my graduate students said we were talking about post-traumatic stress disorder. And one of my graduate students said, Dr. G, I know about post-traumatic stress disorder, but ain't nothing post about the trauma that my young people experience. Ain't nothing post about it. So what term do we have for that? And we really didn't have a term. So they came up with a term, persistent traumatic stress environment. And this is what we're in now, right? We know that from the Surgeon General's report that came out in January, the profound research that the Surgeon General did is calling attention to the national crisis and emergency on young people's mental health. We also recognize that it is not just young people, y'all, right? That our exposure, right? Our exposure to these issues also have an eroding impact on our own mental and health and well-being. And that oftentimes we believe that our jobs are so focused on supporting young people when we have failed to build the systems of support for the adults. And so we find ourselves burnt out, stressed out, hopeless, and looking for another job. And we need to stay into this. And so part of my graduate students were saying in this thinking about persistent traumatic stress environment is that we need to redefine what harms young people and what harms our system. And so as we do that, we broaden our understanding from this sort of medical model, right, which is thinking about mental and behavioral risk. Right? We know that it's important to understand these behavioral and mental health risks. But we also recognize that if we only focus on treatment, counseling, and therapy, that is half of the equation. And what we need to do is look further upstream and recognize the root causes of disproportionate exposure to mental and behavioral challenges. What are those challenges? Those are issues of social inequality, racism, homophobia, sexism. We know that the institutions themselves, we're working with park and recs in some cities, we're working with nonprofits where the inequalities are actually built into these systems. Let me just pause for 1 second because this is an important one. One community that we're working in, there are probably 50 nonprofit organizations, and they all rely on one funder for this entire community. One funder to support behavioral mental health of young people. And so we're working with this group now to say that's baked in inequality, man. How are you gonna actually deliver the service when you have one funder? So we're working with them now to organize to actually create a tax for the city, a pool that actually is dedicated to youth development professionals and out-of-school time professionals. So they're broadening their ability to have funding to advance their work. So sometimes it's baked into the institutions. And then lastly, the living conditions where young people live, work, and play. And so when we talk about these issues that harm young people, the term my graduate students use, persistent traumatic stress environment, it does a couple of things. This is one of the things that, Jamie, that if we could start using this term in our own work and thinking about young people. Persistent, first of all, means that there's an ongoingness of stress. It doesn't mean we accept it, but it means that we are conscious and aware of the persistentness of it, as well as the persistentness on us. That we are not somehow, because we're adults and we got college degrees and we got paychecks, that somehow we are immune from it. I know, y'all, I'm gonna just be up real with y'all, man. When, I think the last time I talked to you in September, there was a shooting outside of one of the high schools, and there was a shooting that same morning outside of the school that I went next to. And I was bothered, I was so distraught. I don't even know how I showed up for that talk, but I was not happy. And so that exposure has an eroding impact on our well-being. The second thing persistent traumatic stress does is it says that the disease, the issue, is not only sitting with the young person, right? It's also it's in the environment and in the conditions that create the stress. And so we're moving from pathologizing young people to actually looking at the conditions that create challenges for young people. So persistent traumatic stress environment also requires us to think outside of the lens of our programs. It means that we're asking questions about funding. It means that we're asking questions about our collective well-being, right? One of the biggest challenges that I faced in thinking about healing is that my training was that young people need individual therapy. And the exposure and experience to persistent traumatic stress environment affects any young person in that school or in that neighborhood. And so we also have to think about a collective response to healing. That it is not 1, 2, 3 individual, but it is a collective response. James Gabarino, in a book called Raising Children in a Socially Toxic Environment, comes up with, I think, another term that I think is really useful here. And he says that when we work, live, and play in a persistently traumatic stress environment, it produces social toxicity. right? It's toxic. And he says that just like there are physical toxins, like you worked where you live right now, just think if you had lead paint or asbestos, and you were breathing lead paint and asbestos into your body. Gabarino says that exposure to that asbestos and lead paint, well, first it'll kind of make you sick. But if you don't go to the doctor, right, and say, doctor, I'm not feeling well, I think I've been breathing asbestos and lead paint. If you don't go to the doctor, that exposure to that physical toxin can become lethal. But you go to the doctor and the doctor diagnoses it and says, don't breathe in asbestos and lead paint. We'll remove you from that environment. We'll give you the kinds of things you need. Gabarino says that there are social equivalents to physical toxins. And social equivalents are things like fear, uncertainty, shame, disappointment. All of these are deeply embedded in the environment and become, over time, toxic to the well-being of not just young people, but our well-being as well. And so this notion of social toxicity has to be responded to in a way that is beyond our notions of treatment. We can treat 1, 2, 3 young people, but we have to think more collectively and broadly about that. This means, for example, in our organizations and the systems that we're in. And I'll just ask the question now. How many of us have in your organization or whatever system you're in, systems of support for the adults in the system? Let me tell you what I mean systems of support. Now, most folks, raise your hand. You have systems of support. Now, usually when I ask that question, here's how people respond. Yeah, we have health insurance, right? Or you could take sick days, right? So in order to actually get well-being, you got to get sick first. Y'all, are you listening to me? Right? So, and that is a system of support. I'm not just counting that. But what about sabbaticals? What about wellness days? What about having some intentionality about how to directly respond to social toxicity so that we can assure that the workforce that's working with our young people are well, right? So, okay, let me keep going here. All right. So, most of the time, this is a model that we use in our trainings on healing-centered engagement. And I just wanted to spend just a couple of seconds on this model because I think it really helps outline some of the challenges that we're in. This is basically a systemic change model. You may have seen it, and it's actually supposed to be an iceberg, but I ain't a good artist, so I just use a triangle, right? So you see the water line? Above the water line are things that happen. Okay, and let me just say this, and I'm gonna just take some time today, y'all. So the reason we continue to have persistent shootings in our schools where children are being exposed to violence, right? We haven't been able to solve that problem. And we haven't been able to solve that problem because of this diagram here. And that's because we continue to ask what happened and respond to the event. Okay? The event, there shouldn't be shootings in schools. You're right. So we respond to the thing that happened. And partly because it is the most visible and the most tangible, that thing we can see. But we react. And we conclude, and we try to say, well, we have better policy around gun control, or we have more mental health. That's kind of where the debate is, right? Y'all check me if I'm wrong. But that's where we are. But we haven't gone beneath the waterline. This is what I'm saying is the journey for healing-centered work. We have to go below the waterline. And below the waterline is a little scary, and I'm going to be real with you. Because below the waterline implicates you. It forces us to look at our own stuff, our own insecurities, and guess what? Our own trauma. Because if we don't look at that, guess what? We continue to reproduce the same thing. So when we go beneath the waterline, we ask different questions. The first question is, what have been the trends? Like, why is this continuing to happen? We go further down the waterline, what are the structures that influence that pattern? And if we go even deeper, we go, what are the assumptions, the beliefs, the values that we hold that produce the patterns, or the structures, the patterns, and then the events? So this is the journey around healing-centered work. Healing-centered work requires us as adults to do our own transformation, to do our own work, so that the ecosystem that young people find themselves in become more aligned. And it is not simply a strategy or another program. It is a way that we think. It's a way that we act and show up for each other. It is a transformation in how we think about systems, not just creating new policies and tools and strategies, but how we actually show up to align systems in ways that are profound and powerful for young people. So I want to talk about hope. The research on hope I came across some years ago because I was feeling hopeless. Much of the research that I was exposed to and I was reading in educational research and youth development research was what I call essentially measuring misery kind of research. Y'all know what measuring misery, like it's the kind of research that talks about school suspensions and expulsions and all that kind of stuff. And my own work with young people, while I knew that, I didn't want to just focus on the misery reduction, right? The misery reduction is, for example, when we talk about school violence, right? Or we talk about school safety or even public safety. Generally what we do, I believe, is we use the wrong indicators for school safety or neighborhood safety. For example, we talk about we've reduced violence, which is an important prerequisite, right? We reduce violence or we reduce bullying in our school. Mm-hmm. But the reduction of violence and the reduction of bullying is not the same as the presence of peace. It's not the same. Just like the absence of illness doesn't mean you're healthy, right? Just like the absence of war doesn't mean you're in peacetime, right? So I think that when we are talking about hope and we're talking about healing, we have to name the outcomes that we want to see. No one in here wants to live in a neighborhood that's violently reduced. You want to live in a neighborhood that's peaceful. The neighborhood I grew up in, while it was a working class poor neighborhood, my mama used to say, some of y'all probably know this phrase, "Boy, bring your butt home when the street lights come on." I mean, we were playing in the street, right? Mm-hmm. We were safe to play in the streets, right? And we would play tag and all that kind of stuff. But it was see, I'm going off topic, y'all. Where am I here? Okay, hope, all right. So we have to name what we want to see and the outcomes we want to see. And so hope theory says that there are 3 ingredients for cultivating hope in ourselves and in the work with young people. The first thing about hope is a sense of future goal orientation. That means I'm cultivating the ability, like my mama did, y'all, to see beyond the present condition, right? That's the first ingredient. The second is that you have, so that's goal orientation. The second is that you have a sense of agency. Part of what trauma does is it makes you powerless. I can't do anything about it. I feel hopeless, I feel powerless. So hope says you have to cultivate a sense of agency in our programs, in our after-school programs. The third thing it says is that we have to create opportunities and pathways. If you create future goal orientation, if you create agency and pathways, you are cultivating conditions of hope for young people. I first learned about that in a healing circle that I was doing with African American young people in Oakland. There was about 15 young men. And the young men that I was working with, I was using trauma-informed approaches. And my goal on Wednesday night was to have these young men understand that the trauma they had experienced as a child was influencing their behavior. This is why you use guns, this is why you steal, this is why you use violent language, this is why you substance abuse. So every Wednesday night I would have them basically recount the worst thing that ever happened to them. And one night, we were sitting in our chairs, and Marcus, one of the young men, and some of you may have read this in the article that I wrote called Shifting from Trauma-Informed Care to Healing-Centered Engagement, came from Marcus. Marcus said, Dr. G, man, I like coming here on Wednesday nights and eating pizza and all that, man, but why do we always have to talk about the worst thing that ever happened to us? He said, I'm more than my trauma. I want to talk about the fact that I want to open up my own t-shirt store. And when he said that, the other young men in the group looked at him and was like, yeah, man, I don't want to open up a coffee shop, but nobody believes I want to open up a coffee shop. And all of the young men changed the conversation from the trauma to the dreams. And they were running the circle. They were sharing about what they wanted to do in the future, what they wanted in their lives. And I was just kind of sitting back. But it made me go back and really interrogate my reading and understanding of trauma-informed approaches. And one of the things I recognize is that we have to begin that while trauma-informed approaches are important, we have to build on it. Because young people have assets that are healing. And that those assets are actually an antidote, right? It becomes a way in which young people can actually become well again, even as they navigate through their issues of trauma. I clicked the slide too soon, but I'll say it anyway. Right? So one of the young men in the group, his name is John, and as these young men were going around sharing their stories, John said, I'll go back, because you already saw it, I'm like, that's all. I wasn't supposed to click the slide yet, but it's okay. John said, Dr. G, everybody wants to open up a business. I don't want to open up a business. I want to be a firefighter here in Oakland. And John at the time was homeless. John was still substance abuser. And actually at the time, there were people looking for John, right? There were people looking for John. So all of the young men in the group were like, John, really, dude? Like, you got a long way, man. Like, you got some work to do. And so John was like, no, this is what I want to do. We connected all of the young men with services after our, it was about a 6-month program that we were working with them on. And they all had my number. And this was probably about 4 years ago. And I kept in contact with these young men over time. They would send me a text. About a year and a half ago, I was doing a talk, and I would never forget it. It was at the GEO conference. I don't know if you guys were at the GEO conference in Chicago. I was feeling good after the keynote, and I got in a taxi to get ready to go to the airport, and I got a text from John. He said, Dr. G, how you doing? I'm like, I'm doing good, John. How you doing? And when I said, how you doing, he sent back this image. And it was an image of him. I was like, oh, and I get emotional every time I think about it. Y'all gotta excuse me, but yeah, man, John's a firefighter now, with a healthy family and children. Right? And it was, it wasn't just our healing circle, but it was a constellation of systems that saw his dreams, that allowed for him to now be a firefighter in Oakland. And so I share that because when we talk about hope and goal orientation, it is not just a strategy, it is creating the conditions to see in young people sometimes the things they don't even see in themselves, and creating the spaces for them to relish in their own dreams and imagination. Heart. What does it actually take? How do we actually cultivate the conditions that are courageous enough to create healing in our communities? I was working with a group of young men in a place called Richmond, North Richmond, California, that had a high instance of gun violence. And the city of Richmond continued to hire more police officers as a response to ongoing gun violence. And so there was no correlation, by the way, right? So they were like, more police officers, we're not reducing violence. And so a friend of mine, brilliant youth development professional, now has his own consulting work called Cure Violence. His name is Devon Bogan. His idea was, let's hire, listen now, he said, let's hire formerly incarcerated young men and women, who just been released, who know the neighborhood, to develop loving relationships with these young folks who carry guns. And we could get the city to pay for it. We don't have to raise no money, we want to get the city to pay for it. And we went to the city and they laughed at it. Get out of here. We're not going to pay for tax dollars to hire, right? And a year later they came back to Devon like, we need your help. So he designed a program, a project that is now a city office. It's not a nonprofit organization. It is not part of the city. It is part of the city infrastructure. It sits between park and recs and youth development and police and the policing. It's called the Office of Neighborhood Safety. And what he does is he hires formerly incarcerated young men and women. Now, why? Let me just say why. And if I'm going too long, somebody tell me to shut up and. Okay. I got you. So why hire formerly incarcerated young men and women from the neighborhood? Here's what he says. Because if I hire someone from UC Berkeley or one of the colleges, when they talk to a young person, they're not gonna know their mama or their daddy or the history that their daddy had beef with somebody else. Or when I hire them, they have a genealogy, they have a history, a family history of everybody. So it says, it looks something like this. Hey, young man, what's your name? Greg, what's your last name? Oh, my name is Greg Wilson. Greg Wilson? Oh, you must be Greg Wilson Jr. Oh, yeah, I played football with your daddy, right? Sorry, what happened to you? In other words, they have a relationship prior to the relationship. Y'all feel me? And so they were able to exploit that relationship to really begin to cultivate these relationships with young people. Now, this is what it looked like, right? Kind of looked like older guys talking to younger guys. Wasn't really profound when I went out and studied it. But when I watched them and listened to them, they were trained to say three things. And the first I didn't believe it. The first thing they were trained to say is, hey man, I want you to be live and free. The second thing is, I care about you. And as they left the conversation, they would say, I love you, right? Now I know that sounded hella corny, y'all. We say hella in Oakland, so man, I don't know what that is. Let me get the professor here. I know that sounded very strange. Saying that I love you. All right, so they say, I'm like, man, Devon, you train him to say, yeah, man. But the younger people like, yeah, right, that sounds whatever. But they actually follow it up with something profound and caring. So they would say, hey, I know you joined, the Pop Warner League. I got some cleats in my car. Hey, your mama said she couldn't get over the grocery store. I got some groceries for your mama. Take this to your mama. In other words, they were being like an uncle. They weren't trying to prevent violence, don't carry guns. They weren't doing that. And in fact, oh my God, I don't have enough time, y'all. In fact, they said, and they still say this, we don't tell the kids not to carry guns. Because we from the neighborhood. We don't tell them to do that because that's inauthentic for us. We say, you got to carry a gun. But if you need to go use it, call us first, man. That's what they say. So there was an incident that happened. Some of the young men that Devon was working with, there was a shooting at a party, right? And they were getting ready to go retaliate. And they remembered what Joe said, if you need to use a gun, call me first. This is Joe. And so they called Joe. Like, Joe, we're getting ready to ride, man. We're getting ready to ride. Joe's like, okay, I know y'all getting ready to ride. Come over to the office first. Let's talk it out. tell me what's going on. I know they shot up the spot. So Joe, they went to go see Joe. And Joe said, okay, I know what you guys got to do. But let's go get some pizza first. That was supposed to be funny. But he said something like that. Let's go get some food first, right? And the kids, they're kids. They're 13, 14 years old. So they go, okay, let's go get some pizza. They're children, y'all. These are children. And so they go get pizza, and he's able to de-escalate, talk them down. And Joe said, this is what I do 5 or 6 days a week. And all of us do that. And if you do that over and over again, this is the results you get. In 2014, they had 45 homicides. By 2009, they had 45, but by 2014, they had 12. And even today, it's even lower than that. Wow. It's lower than that. They did not increase their budget for the police. And in fact, they were able to hire these outreach workers for a fraction of the cost. Devone calls the young men that they work with fellows. They used to call them shooters. That's what the program says, they're shooters. And Devone said, no, they're not shooters, they're fellows. Let's bring them into our fellows program. Why do we call them fellows? Devone says, we're going to invest in them. And so, yeah, they carry guns, but we're going to tell them to put the guns down because we're going to take them to Washington, D.C. And they took them to Washington, D.C. They've been to South Africa. They invest in them. And over that time investment, they get these kinds of outcomes. Healing. All of this is healing. And all of us are already doing this, right? This is what we're already doing. What I'm trying to present is a cohesive way that we can think about saturating healing opportunities for young people in Philadelphia. We're already doing it. But how do we bring together the best of what we're doing in our school time, in after-school programs, in our school districts, in park and recreation, and the police department? How do we bring this together in a way that we can call healing, create a healing-centered city, that we're already doing it? It's not new, because it's already part of what we're doing. A friend of mine talked about, I was sharing this idea about healing, about how we can heal our cities, about how we can heal our schools. And she was a botanist at UC Berkeley. And she said, you're talking about toxicity and healing. There's this experiment, Shawn, that we do at UC Berkeley about toxic environments. And she said that we put these plants in these chambers, right, these chambers, and we try to measure how the plant responds to different kinds of toxins. And so one time we put one plant in there and we pumped the chamber with different kinds of gas, toxic gas, and we watched the plant, how long it would last, and ultimately the plant died. And she said that for one time, we didn't just put one plant in the chamber, we put a bunch of plants in there to see if the plants would react to the toxicity we were pumping into it. We put a whole community of plants in there, a bunch of them. And we pumped the chamber with gas. And to our amazement, something miraculous happened when we had the collection of plants. She said the plants began to kind of pull out different nutrients out of the soil. And they began to metabolize or process those nutrients in a different way. And then the plants began to emit a gas in that chamber that cleaned up the toxic gas we were pumping in.
Wow.
They detoxified their environment. That's healing. Right? This is what we're talking about. How are we actually working together to detoxify the environments in Philadelphia? How are we working together to create the conditions for young people to dream and thrive? That process is what we call healing-centered engagement, which is a perspective, it's an approach, and it's a strategy that allows for us to think about the well-being of young people and not just fixing young people, not just responding to the problems. Healing-centered engagement is strength-based, and it provides a holistic view of healing and well-being. Holistic means that it is not just mental health, not behavioral health, not just physical health. It's the holistic way of thinking about well-being, and it involves our own sense of healing and well-being. That we are part of an ecosystem, just like those plants working in community. The soil was part of the ecosystem, right? The air was part of the ecosystem. And so how are we actually working together to create that ecosystem for healing for young people? So we're suggesting, right, in our healing-centered approach, not abandoning our exposure and our use of trauma-informed care. We need acute responses to trauma. It must be, it's important. But what we're suggesting is that we have to also add healing-centered approaches. And so, while here's some of the distinctions between trauma-informed approaches and healing-centered approaches. So trauma-informed approaches may begin with the question about, okay, what's happened? What happened to you? Healing-centered starts with what's right with you, right? While trauma-informed may focus on episodic harm, a healing-centered approach, just like my graduate students, they understand trauma is persistent and ongoing in an environment where a trauma-informed approach focuses on treatment. Right? You got to respond, treatment, and therapy and counseling are important. The healing-centered approach says that our responses have to be collective, and they have to think about creating the conditions of well-being. And while trauma-informed approaches focuses on treating clients, that is, I'm trained as a therapist or as a psychologist or as a teacher or as an out-of-school time youth development professional, my job is to work with that young person. Well, Healing Center says yes, and we need systems of support for you as well. Right? And so we need both of these approaches. What is it that young people can do in Philadelphia? What can they do in their schools that actually create the kind of environments they want to see? The third principle is relationships. Just like Devone. Devone didn't just have relationships. There are two kinds. There are transactional relationships, the kind of relationships that I interact with you because it's my job, and then after my job is done, I'm done, right? Or I have to go on lunch break, and I'm not gonna, it's just a function of my title. And then there's transformative relationships. And transformative relationships are the kind of relationships that are based on our humanity, right? They're based on who we are as human beings. And we can invest and cultivate that in our programs and in our organization. The fourth is meaning, which is what meaning do young people have about where they're going in society, about why they're in school, about why they're in this after-school program. Meaning is also important for us. Why am I doing this? Right? When it gets really tough, right? How are we using meaning and actually reminding ourselves why this is important? And the last is aspiration. And this is the lesson from my mother, right? That we have to cultivate the capacity to dream, to imagine, and saturate young people's lives with that capacity to see beyond the present condition. So these are the 5 principles of healing-centered strategies and healing-centered work. Our goal is to really just support the amazing out-of-school time work that's already happening in Philadelphia and begin to weave together a fabric of healing so that the strategies that are already on the ground and our work with the school district of Philadelphia, we'll be working with the school district of Philadelphia to really strengthen these practices both in the school district and out of school time and any systems where young people find themselves, so that we can claim and really see Philadelphia as a healing-centered city where young people and adults are together, combining forces, working together to create the kind of opportunities and the healing that's necessary to actually have young people live and step into their aspirations. Thank y'all so much. This was I'm gonna stop here. Is that cool? And just kind of open it up for some questions. That cool? All right, let's do that.
Dr. Ginwright, I have a question because many people in the room come from traditional behavioral health providers. And I'm just wondering how the work of a therapeutic provider that's working with young people that might have a diagnosis or the early stage of diagnosis, how this looks when you integrate with traditional therapeutic practices.
Yeah, great question. So the question is how there are those who have deep experience and work around therapeutic practices. How does a healing-centered approach weave in, or how does it sort of support a therapeutic approach? So as I said before, first, the clinical approach is necessary. Right? There are young people that have diagnoses, right? And we need to be able to respond to and support young people with treatment and so forth. What this approach offers is a couple of things. My own training and exposure to therapeutic and clinical approaches first starts with the thing that's wrong. In other words, what I want to do is address your symptomology. I want to reduce your anxiety. I want to reduce your behavioral pathology. I want to reduce whatever it is. The diagnosis is usually a diagnosis of some form of pathology, of behavioral mental health pathology. That's important to address. What healing-centered engagement says is that that's necessary, but it's also insufficient. We also have to actually begin with, we also have to focus on identifying your assets, right? What I mean by assets is, what are the things, what do young people have as assets that we could actually use and focus on as an essential pathway to their own healing? Right? What do they dream about? Right? How do we actually begin to couple their therapeutic approaches with some of their assets? The second approach is that oftentimes the clinical approach generally is focused on an individual young person. Right? That this young person has this symptomology, this condition, this exposure, which is important. What the healing-centered approach does is it focuses on the collective. And so we move from an individual intervention to a collective intervention. What is a collective intervention? This might look like healing circles every Thursday night, where 6 or 7 of your clients come together, and they're not talking about the worst thing that ever happened to them, but they may talk about, you might start talking about, oh, what do you want to do? What do you want to be living, or what do you want to be doing 5 years from now? Or if you could travel anywhere, where would you go? In other words, the healing circle is not just like focusing on, like the traumatic experience, but it's really beginning to create the safety for young people to share what's inside. Let me just give you one more example. So at Camp Achille, the camp that I talked about, basically are scaffolded. This is Camp Achille's principle. And at Camp Achille, we bring young people in from the entire San Francisco Bay Area that have significant exposure to all these issues around trauma. It takes 2 days to create the safety for young people to first share, because they come in with their diagnosis. I thought I was here because I have ADHD. I'm labeled ADHD, right? One of the things we do is we don't even want to look at their diagnosis. We assume everybody's got ADHD. We just assume that everybody has some behavioral mental health, right? So let's just start there. We don't need their files. We tell the school district, don't send their files. General information, we don't want their files, right? We assume everyone has that. And so if we assume that, now the first thing we do is build safety, right? And how do you build safety? There's a lot of ways that we build safety, but you build safety by first, the adults in the space have to be courageous enough to share their stuff. And that's scary, because adults who are trained therapists and social workers, we're trained, you gotta keep distance, right? And so we're saying, no, that's cool, but you actually gotta tell them about your own abuse at some point. You actually gotta tell them about, your own upbringing. You actually have to tell them about whatever it is, because when that creates the safety that allows for the young people to then have the opportunity in the space for them. So the second thing is community healing, right? It's collective healing. And then the third and last is an awareness of the environmental causes of trauma, right? So we have to broaden from an episodic form of trauma to thinking about the conditions in the neighborhood writ large. Great question. Yes?
how do we create those conditions in a society that on its whole is individualistic? I mean, I read out the pandemic in Europe, and our response was completely different to what was going on in the States, and it was so odd to watch back. But at the heart, it was the rugged individualism versus the collectivism that, at least where I was in Europe, there was this idea of we're going to do what's good for the collective good. How do we even start when everything we turn on is about me and I and what I need in this group and that group and NAGA and all of that?
Okay.
Two sentences, please.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole nother topic. So it's a big question, and I don't have an answer to all. What I do have a response to is absolutely right that we have hyper-individualistic culture, and there are spaces of profound loving community. Right? They're both. And in your organization, some of you may work in systems and organizations that feel like systems and organizational bureaucracy, and you like clock in and you clock out and you leave. And some of us, work in like a community, right? And so what I'm suggesting is those systems that feel like I just clock in and clock out, where are the 5 people that you feel like you can be in community with? And start there. Just start there. And those of us who are already working in community, then how do we actually be more intentional about broadening that community, right? Yes, it's difficult, and this is the culture that we work in, but I think we have to start. And the reason I'm so passionate about it is because I've seen it. I've been to Philadelphia. I know there's community, right? And so there's community in the institutions and out of school time, and it is. I think it's about being intentional about building and strengthening and investing in that community. Let me just give you one quick suggestion for those of you who are directors, for those of you who have access over budgets, for those of you who oversee teams, right? Invest in the ability for your team to go away, to spend time together. Not professional development. This is slightly different. Professional development is good because it trains you to be better at whatever you do as a professional. But we also want personal growth and development, because your own growth and personal development will actually make you a better professional.
Yeah.
But it doesn't go the other way around. Like, if I train you to be a better professional, it doesn't mean you have a better relationship with your mama. Come on. Yeah, I'm sorry, I stepped into something there, but y'all know what I'm talking about, right? That your better professional stuff doesn't actually contribute to your growth as a human being. And so those of us who have teams and try to invest in community, we actually have to invest in communities where people can spend time together. Can I add one more thing to this? So we were working in, I'm not going to name the neighborhood, but it was in Omaha, Nebraska. I'm sorry. I hope nobody thought it was recording. Sorry. Sorry.
I can edit it out if we need to.
Anyway, I messed up. This is what happens when you go off script. Get right. Stick with the script. All right, we're working in Omaha, Nebraska. A funder has brought us in because community-based organizations that were working primarily African American youth didn't get along. Right? They were battling over funding. They were doing all this stuff, right? And so they brought us in like, hey, we think healing would be good for working with these nonprofit organizations, building a sense of community. They're so individualistic and they have their own fight. And these are my young people. And so we went in there. The first meeting, you could cut the tension with a knife. It was like, oh man, it was tough. Like they were, they basically told us to leave and who the hell we thought we were and all this kind of stuff. But we stuck with it, man, because we believe in community. And we got the folks in the room, and we really went through these principles, and we really worked with their own trauma. These are EDs, right? These are board members of nonprofit organizations. And we were working through their own trauma. I don't trust you because you took that grant, and I don't trust. We worked through that, and it took a while. And then we said to the funder, and this is for those folks who are funders here, giving people the spaciousness to define that journey. We went to the funder and said, we need to get folks out of this community so that they can reimagine what they want to do in the community. And one of the principles in my new book called 4 Pivots is possibility thinking, right? It's the 5th principle, but it is cultivating the work. It's not just, oh, dreaming. No, possibility thinking takes work to imagine something different. And it's hard to see something or imagine if you've never seen it. So we said to the funder, hey, funder, we need to take 20 people, these are executive directors and board members, out of the neighborhood. They want to go to Hawaii for a week. And we want you to pay for it. And well, listen. No, I'm telling you, y'all. So the people, the folks that were running the organizations, they were like, no, we just want to go to the Park and Rec's cabin around the corner, right? So we had to work with them to imagine that it was even possible. And so they worked together, we got it, and the funder's like, okay. So we took them to Hawaii for a week, and we worked through a lot of stuff, and they came back and said, wow, we actually see the benefit of community. Now we are called a collective. That's what they call themselves now, collective. So my point is that even in spaces and in neighborhoods where there's challenges in organizations around individualism, the investment in building community, we know this is how people lie, right? It could be like the Bahamas or something. But investing in community, having an intentional investment in community, contributes to something that you wouldn't be able to do if you just invested in a better strategy. Right? So, great question. Yeah.
Can you talk more about building those transformative relationships while also sort of what healthy boundaries are around, especially since a lot of our staff members are sort of recently out of the youth development as a youth participant themselves, and sort of avoiding reenactment and things like that.
Yeah. So I think there has to be some intentional training, right? So it's not like you just, hey, I heard Ginwright say I have to talk about my trauma to you, so that's what I'm doing, right? so it's don't take that away, right? But I want to say 2 things. One, I think it's first recognizing the clinical limits of transformative relationship that we've been trained on, right? Those boundaries come from our professional training, and those boundaries are important. In one school district we were working in, one principal told me, I'll never forget, she said there's a child that came that was crying and she wanted to hug the child. She couldn't hug the child because of boundaries, right? And of course it makes sense, right, in professional settings. But we also have to recognize the limits of that as well, right? And we know that nothing profound occurs outside of a profound relationship. Nothing happens. And so the training then is, how do I, one, acknowledge and understand the things that are important for me that I can share? What is the purpose of me sharing, right? So if you just share because you want to, just share without an intentionality, but if the intent for you to share is to create safety, and create a sense of I'm with you, then there's ways to do that, right? And so, I would encourage in our Healing Center certification, there's some examples and processes that you use, but it's not just creating, I'm just going to divulge all of my business because this is what Ginwright said. So there are levels of vulnerability, for example, but it is vulnerability that we're trying to get at. Because we know that through the lens of vulnerability, that honesty, and through that vulnerability, that is what creates the kind of relationship that that allows for young people to go on that journey. I don't know if that answers the question. Yeah, right here and then right here.
Okay, thank you. So my question was, so essentially I'm a support specialist coordinator currently right now, and I do have a lot of connections to presentation personally. My major was communication social influence, I went to Temple. So essentially in practice, how would you do this? So I have a young child who is in the building, that's not his name, but essentially he, a year ago lived in a home, had, mom and brother, and recently I just got information that essentially now he lives in a homeless shelter and he has all these behavioral issues at school and he's working with like an IEP and stuff like that.
Mhm.
But I went to a meeting yesterday and essentially one of the big things that I took away, which is similar to this, was kind of funny how it segues, was basically that trauma is not only violent, and sometimes trauma could be, being displaced from a home or different things like that, and it's not necessarily something like, being shot or different things like that, but these children don't understand or know how to emotionally and behaviorally understand those things and transition it to words. So my question to you would essentially be like, in practice, how would you apply what you spoke about today to that situation for this young 6-year-old in kindergarten?
Great question. The question was, tell me your name.
Noemi?
Noemi just gave me a concrete example of a 6-year-old that has trauma exposure, that has behavioral issues. How would Healing Centered approaches work with that young person? That's the question. So one tool that we recognize in Healing Centered work is that part of what trauma does is that it silences, right? That you can't access emotions. You don't know it. I'm feeling this way, but I can't access it. But when you can express it and get it out, that actually becomes part of the process. So one just concrete tool is many young people don't have the emotional, and not just young people, some of us adults, don't have the emotional vocabulary to talk about the thing that's happening, right? So what I would suggest, Naomi, is it Naomi? Noemi, is to first work on the student's emotional vocabulary. How do you do that? One, how are you feeling, right? How are you feeling? Now, most young people, it's 6 years old, may not say this, but my experience is when I talk to young people, I say, well, how you feeling? What's going on? They respond in 3 ways. I'm cool. I'm all right. I'm good. Now, I realized that there was something wrong with that because I used to go like, okay, yeah, cool. That's kind of how I used to take it until one of the young people in my program years ago was shot, and I went to his boys. I'm like, what happened? You cool? What's going on? How are you feeling? And they said, I'm all right. I'm cool. I'm good. And I could see it in their face that I'm scared. I'm hurt. I'm afraid. I could just see it, right? And I'm like, oh, they can't. So I'm giving you a lot of explanation. Is start with an emotional inventory, right? First, what are the emotions that young person can name, right? Instead of I'm cool, I'm all right, I'm good. Like, oh, are you sad? Okay, let's talk about sadness. Are you afraid? Are you, just start understanding how many emotions can that young person name? Just start with that. And your goal is to double that in a month. To double the emotions. Now, whenever I say something for young people, I also say it for adults. Okay, how many emotions can you name? Right? Name your, in a day, how did you feel? How are we keeping inventory of our own emotions throughout the day? So at the end of the day, you might want to write down, I felt frustrated, I felt excited, I felt nervous, I felt scared. In other words, you're going on the emotional vocabulary journey with the young person. When you're with that young person, now you could share what you're learning together. So that it is not seen just as, oh, I'm gonna fix you. Remember, we're not just fixing young people. We're in this together. So you're engaging in your emotional vocabulary journey. And that young person is engaging in their emotional vocabulary journey. And so your interaction is now we're talking about our emotions. Well, I had 7 emotions yesterday. How many did you have? Let's talk about those. So that's one specific tool. Hopefully that will
Sorry about that. I have one more thing to say. So I understand that one other person has to, so be really quick. So essentially, I'll do something where I'll go ahead and have a picture board, and I'll go ahead and just show me which one of those that you have and stuff like that.
Mhm.
So it's very similar, and I've
Yep.
already implemented that. But essentially, sometimes he won't be able to do that or be receptive to that, so he'll go ahead and act out and find a kid and just it or different things like that. So essentially, what would be the solution for something like that? Because there's also that disconnect of wanting to listen to those older than mom, dad, sister, brother, teachers, all those things. So,
Yeah, I mean, I was just, it's consistency.
Okay.
It's just consistency. It's like one, it's not gonna work with just one or two times, right? And more than anything, that 6-year-old needs to know you, sis. He needs to know you, like, know you. Like, not just, I'm in here, I don't know what your interaction is.
I mean, my interaction
Yeah.
with them is like, auntie.
Yes,
That.
yes, so be the auntie. That's what really matters, and showing up like auntie, right? And so that takes time. It takes time. And so going on that journey, that emotional literacy journey, but just keep showing up. Authentically, not as a professional, right? But showing up as auntie, you'll begin to see that trust and that journey for him to begin to change and listen to you in a different way.
Can I add on to something?
Yes.
So, a method that I use for my students is give a day. My 6-year-old, they love marble. You know, we speak them, who's your research, even if you don't want to, they're gonna come back.
So I just want to make sure everybody heard. The response was be relatable. Find something that they are interested in and use that as a hook to actually take them on where you want them to be. Right?
All right, so my question was, how do we know the professionals, we know what people do, but how do we get the parents?
Yes, thank
you.
The parents that are single, working, incarcerated, active, how
Yeah.
do we get them involved with what we're doing?
Yeah. So that is there's an ecosystem. There's a youth, there's the school, right? There's out of school time, and then there's parents, right? With parents, I think it's important to create their own sort of support group, so to speak, right? So bringing parents together regularly about what's happening with their kids, not just, sometimes what parents do get is, oh, come see us, your kid's been messing up. And that's our interaction with them, right? And so it's reactive rather than proactive. And so so we used to create we call them chat and choose. And I'm sure this is probably something that you've already done. First, have some good food. Right? And we realize that's important because, parents work, and so when they come after school time, they want to have they want to have food. So the chat and choose is basically an opportunity for parents to it's an intentional investment on organizing and working with parents through a similar process. It's not different from the young person, it is similar because the parents are dealing with stuff too. And so if it's always just about what you ain't doing if it's always about what you're not doing say what? Blaming and shaming, right? If it's that, then parents don't want that, right? And so chat and choose basically works like this. You have food, they come, they eat, and they're talking, and then we talk about what's happening with this, a little bit about what happened with the program. And then we stop. And then we kind of go into, okay, we use our healing center stuff. Let's do emotional inventory. What's coming up for you? And it becomes a support group about what's happening with those parents, right? So we can actually begin to support their own mental health. It is collective. It is, and what we found is when we stopped doing the chat and choose, the parents found it so valuable that they continued it. They continued it. Why did they continue it? Because they're like, man, I thought I was the only one dealing with this, right? And I could give you so many, actually was one y'all, let me just be real, I'm just tell you. I was going through with my son when he was 15. And I have talked and lectured about youth development and working with teens until I had one. Y'all feel me? Until I had a 15-year-old, looking at me like he the grown man in the house. Anyway, stay focused on me. So anyway, I was in the chat machine, and I was working with my son, and I was just sharing the frustrations that I was having, and some of the other parents had some of the same experiences. And part of my own healing was, I'm not the only one. You're dealing with that too? Well, what did you do? Here's what I'm trying. And work together to actually support each other on our own stress that we were having with our young people. So that's a long explanation for the parents have to have intentional spaces around their own healing-centered work that is separate from the ecosystem of teachers as well as the young people. Yeah. I thought there was one more, and then is there one? Yeah.
Yep.
So we'll go here, and then.
How can we create healing-centered policies across our systems that support the conditions of personal wellness? I definitely hear, it starts in your circle of influence, how you're connecting and building community. How do we also take both a top-down and bottom-up?
Yeah, great. So the question is, how do we create healing-centered policy in ways that actually shape systems and institutions around the process of healing? Great question. There was an organization in Washington, D.C. that took this idea. It was the Department of Juvenile Probation, and his last name is Lacey. And you know who I'm talking about? Y'all know who I'm talking about? So he said something like, this is what love looks like in public policy. He had a phrase that he used. The intent, the lesson that I got from his work is that we have to start with policy. What is the intent of policy? Right? Policy is nothing but sort of protocols and so forth that achieves a goal of the systems. For Lacey, his intent was, we want loving, caring relationships in the system that incarcerate young people. So let's just start with that. That's what he wanted in the system. He is the chief. So the policies then reflected that idea, right? And so I think it's first, what is the intent of the policy? What are you really trying to create? For Lacey, and there's a group of folks in California, that they started with, how do we begin to shift our policy from punishment and incarceration of young people to youth development? And so they started with shifting the wrong pieces of policy, like, parents can come more frequently, but they're visiting their children behind 6-inch glass. So if we back up and realize that the language that they were using to describe young people were still, they were still calling them offenders. So we have to really interrogate, like, your policy still says offenders, right? So we have to really interrogate, remember that going deep down into the values, look at the values that the language that they're using to describe young people, and then begin to scaffold that. And so what occurred was, with Lacey, as well as with the group of folks in juvenile probation in California, began to shift their system to youth development. So it's youth development policy. The first thing is, the correctional officers are also trained as youth development professionals. So most systems don't do that. Like, you get trained to incarcerate youth. So they also get youth development training. They also get diversity and racial equity training. And so the intent of the policy is to create people in that institution that actually have care and support of young people. And so oftentimes our systems, we believe that we have to follow the policy, but the policy is a function of the people that create it, right? And so a lot more to say on that. In the book that I wrote, The 4 Pivots, it gives us a number of examples of how the people have to change in the systems so that the systems and the policy reflects the people in the system. So the policy is obedient to the vision, not the other way around, right? So anyway, I give some examples of systems that have done that. Great questions. Back here, and then over here. Yeah.
And I guess my question is pretty similar. We're in the middle of a mayoral race right now, and if you stay in Philly long enough, you can catch at least a couple mayoral forums, probably. And public safety and education are how the top issues are being framed. And I would love for Canada to embrace a vision for a healing-centered city. On the other side of policy is, examples where you you match dollars to values in ways that maybe they aren't doing now? Is it about thinking about behavioral health budgets differently? Are there examples that you've seen have gained traction where it's also kind of reframing a public safety or crime issue around, dollars, changing dollars towards healing goals and outcomes?
Yeah, so, we're gonna have more time. So, all right, great question. The question is, how have I seen public policy use healing-centered approaches, and what did that look like?
Particularly with maybe thinking about funding similar to how Richmond has maybe
Got it.
approaches like Richmond, but maybe at a larger scale.
Yeah. So, yes. So, the mayor's office of San Francisco, London Breed, had essentially, the budgets in these large cities like these are like fiefdoms, they're like kingdoms. People don't like letting go of their budgets because that's power, right? The community said, we don't want any more youth prisons. We don't want juvenile halls. And everybody in the mayor's office was like, yeah, but we have mental health dollars and behavioral health dollars and resources for police and so on and so forth. And so what needed to occur was that the head of these divisions of behavioral and mental health, of foster care, of parks and recs that had these huge budgets, first had to get in the room together to create a vision about what they wanted in the city. Right? Now, this was a case of the leadership of London Breed who said we need to actually de-silo our work. And it took a long time. We worked with them for over a year and a half, and it wasn't just me, so I'm just really being clear that this is not a Shawn Ginwright show that I'm giving you an example of. This was part of a larger group of folks. But what it required is for them to recalibrate their vision about de-siloing their work, which means they had to give up something. They had to give up budgets.
Yeah.
The second thing it meant was the community itself had to do some shifts, because the city, the communities, what they were asking for is, defund the police and let's stop investing in youth prisons and youth jails. But they didn't have a vision of what they wanted. So they needed to shift, and they needed to actually begin to articulate what they wanted those dollars for. So about 2 years after that, the city decided, or the community decided, they wanted to take those dollars that were being used and invested in juvenile probation and juvenile halls to create healing centers, right? So now that those dollars that were once, and the facilities themselves, they still have juvenile halls, but they're a fraction of what they were. And a part of the actual facilities are now focused on mental and behavioral health and healing. So now young people can go in there and get the kind of behavioral and mental health supports. In a juvenile, it is, they still haven't taken like the fences and stuff down, right? So it's kind of like weird for a young person to go into a juvenile hall to get mental health support. But they're working on, those are where the dollars are. They're still working on actually how to get young people in there. But that's an example of how those dollars can shift, so that right now there are no more juvenile halls in San Francisco, and those juvenile halls are now focused on behavioral mental health and healing for the city. And it took about a 2.5 year process.
Was that an organic process, or was that a facilitated process?
It was, the question was, the example that I gave, was it an organic process or a facilitated process? So it was facilitated because we had to work with the heads of those departments first, right? So we really had to work with them. The mayor actually gave the direction, like, this is what I want. And then we had to work with the mindset of the people. So that was facilitated. And we had to work with the community groups that were advocating for the closure of juvenile halls, and we had to work with them as well. So it was facilitated over some time. If you want to look at, Google it, it was called San Francisco, I think it's called the San Francisco London Breed's Blue Ribbon Panel on Juvenile Probation. That's the full title of it. Okay. here.
It was over here.
Over here, okay, go ahead. Go that way and then after.
I just, when I was listening to your approach, I just wondered, how did you incorporate the school system, the teachers into your approach? Because you talked about out of school time, but how did we bring the school system into this?
Yeah, so the question was, is how does this approach sort of relate and work with schools and teachers and those that are in school systems, right? So right now we are working with a number of school districts, and mostly it's because the school districts that we're working with, they haven't been able to address the challenge of behavioral mental health of young people. You have a very small bandwidth, a few therapists to work with a lot of the students that actually have that exposure. And so our goal is to train the teachers themselves in healing-centered strategies so that they can integrate healing-centered strategies into their classroom. Doesn't mean that now we're adding teachers as therapists, right? So some people have said, well, now you're adding more work for teachers. Not more work, we're just saying first teachers have to understand that, that the issues that you're seeing come from the community that causes it. Without it, here's what teachers get. More discipline, classroom management, right? And so the first thing is we're working with teachers to get them to understand that the issues that show up in your classroom are created outside of your classroom. Second, give them some tools to be able to respond to some of those behavioral challenges, right? Doesn't mean that they are now therapists, because we're not training therapists, but it means that we're creating the environment in classrooms that can be much more healing-centered. And so they integrate healing-centered questions. For example, they start the class with an emotional check-in, right? They may actually create an opportunity for young people to do projects that talk about their own mental and behavioral health, right? And so they're integrating these into their classroom. One of the biggest was that Brooklyn that they did this in the school district in New York. This was
it was all 5 boroughs.
All 5 boroughs in New York City took the model, and the Department of Education used that to actually drive it into these 5 boroughs in New York City to train teachers, to train the parents and the young people. It was an amazing process that really had created the ecosystem that we're trying to create in Philadelphia.
2 questions. One, how do we get that New York thing here? Maybe
that was a good alley.
Maybe that's on the school district. But the other question is, I hear what you're saying about how we can start this process within our own communities, our own organizations, our own programs. But if we're thinking on how to transform these really large systems that exist in Philadelphia, who is not in the room and how do we get them here?
Yeah, so let me respond to that real quickly. I'm Donna Cooper. I'm the Executive Director of Children First. And I'm so glad you're asking that question because we are beginning the process now to ready this kind of conversation with the next mayor. Now, we all know the next mayor is going to be chosen in very few days from now. That we don't have to wait for the general election to begin the work in Philadelphia to disseminate these practices. Who do they bring in to run the government? What is the vision of that individual? And this is work that we have done before as new mayors have come in to really begin to set the stage. So when you think about the work that when Jim Henney came in to reduce the number of kids who are in juvenile detention, secure facilities, or any kind of facilities, Philadelphia has really driven down those numbers. To increase the partnership between the school district and CBH and DBH, to infuse services together. These are things that we set up right after the primary with Jim Henney, right? Now, this is much more transformation of the system. And I just want to invite anybody in this room that wants to be part of a conversation to think about how we prepare the next mayor to think about the process they need to undertake to enable this kind of work to happen inside city agencies, across city agencies, across systems, CBH, school district, city agencies, and in partnership with parents, kids, and community organizations. See me before you leave, see Nellie, stand up Nellie before you leave, because we're sort of in these tables already, planning this, but this is an opportunity. There's always an opportunity when we start anew with a new leader to make sure that their vision can articulate a healing-centered approach. So please see me before you go.
Did you have something else?
Yeah, sure. So just real quick, my name is Edward Zelaya. I'm the COO of Flourish Agenda. Shawn's my boss. So to your question, so the person that brought this incredible experience to New York, it was an all-encompassing experience where she brought in community members, she brought in parents, she brought in staff. She actually had actual high school students participate in this course, translated it to Arabic, to Mandarin, to Spanish. So we hired her. So she now works for us. And she's working with Jamie on a regular basis to be able to start bringing this to Philadelphia. We work with a lot of school districts and organizations throughout the country. So if you want to know more examples, feel free to reach out to me and come talk to me here, okay? So I'll say that.
I just wanted to know, when you think about the idea of culture, has film-centered approaches, have you collaborated with faith leaders, and what does that process look like?
Yeah, we have not collaborated with faith leaders on this particular topic. I have not spoken to faith communities that are working to create peace in their environment, but we haven't actually engaged faith community in the same way that we're working with youth development systems and so forth. But we would be invited to, absolutely.
So my question is based on Naomi's question earlier, so very, sorry. So based off of that from earlier, I work with kids in a sports-based youth development program. We start at age 4. So they don't have a lot of that emotional capacity for conversation so often, and sometimes behavioral things can come across as something that makes the environment a little bit less safe for other participants or something like that, even if it's just 5 seconds. So how do you recommend sort of addressing that without taking the kid out of practice? We don't want to make them feel like they're being punished, but we want to make sure that the space is safe for everybody. So we want to keep them in, keep them engaged, but still address it.
Yeah, and you use your sports base and age 4?
Yep.
Yeah, so that's verbal but not completely nonverbal. Right? What rituals do you use currently do you have a ritual to set the tone for the thing that you're going to do?
Here we try to, I do a lot of repeating rituals and behavioral rituals at the beginning of practice. We have spots that they stand on. We try to make those spots far enough apart that they can't touch each other. Saying a lot of things about how, in soccer we don't use our hands, we have to keep our hands to ourselves and things like that. And when we can pull aside a kid for a couple of seconds and ask them what's happening with them, and are you okay? How did that make you feel? And try to sort of empathize with other kids that are being impacted by it, but it's hard to do quickly.
Yeah,
it's a highly filtered culture.
One of the things I would just recommend, if you have a ritual, what I mean by that is just something that you do to set the tone, is identify the kind of emotional space you want the 4-year-olds to be in. Like whatever that is, joyful, playful, safe, whatever, but just set that intention. And then in your ritual, before you start practice, I know there's only a certain amount of time, but you have to invest in the thing that you want. So set that intention in your ritual. Like use the language, use the behavior. What does joyful look like? What does safe look like? And then incorporate that in the actual ritual that you're using. I call it ritual is important because if it's not a ritual, then it's just a rote thing to do. Right? It doesn't set the intention about what we're about to do together. Right? So that if you set that intention, then when students when they're not doing it, you could ask, is this an example of what we set our intention to do? The young people can also be part of making sure holding each other accountable for sort of living out the rituals that you set for the group. One thing you might want to do is ask them, what are the ways that we should be in practice, and have them identify it. And then when they have some ownership of that, then they take that on and actually can hold each other accountable for that. Right.
After listening to all of this, I really feel as though like creating karma or these principles of healing being common knowledge is like the best practice to really like take over the community and make a huge impact. If that's wrong, please stop me. But in implementing that to my staff and things like that and trying to give them the tools to have healing-based approach, I would love to be able to like scaffold it to something or practice that they already understand or they're utilizing so that they're able to implement. So aspirations, I really see that as something similar to solution-based therapy and positive behavior reinforcement. Is that something you would agree with? That would be a good tool, or can you like kind of talk about something very particular?
Yeah. So positive behavioral reinforcement, all of these things, there are certainly an overlap, right?
Yeah.
These principles come from really three places, like I said before. So some of this is positive psychology, some of this is around sort of ethnic and identity studies, and the other is around just sociology, right? So they kind of all come from that. But I think there are, if you had a Venn diagram around some of these things, there is an overlap, right? The part of the Venn diagram that is not oftentimes is just the collective nature of how we're engaging with some of these things. So example, positive behavioral supports, trauma-informed approaches. What we're trying to push is for people to think much more collectively about that intervention as opposed to an individual young person. But yes, I guess that was a long explanation.
No,
yes,
that's perfect.
You can look, there's a relationship.
I want to be able to quote us what they already know, so it's not like, here's a new concept. So this is what you're doing.
I want to give you this. So if you do that, I think it works, yeah. Then you can get like this deck and some other cool stuff. This is a toolkit. And it just kind of gives you like, hey, here are the principles, here's some activities, here's some ways you might want to think about healing centered work in your own.
While you're taking that picture, let me just say that we want to we're starting a conversation today, right? And your question about how you translate this into practice, and the question about the 4-year-old, and the question about the 6-year-old, like this is going to take some time in our systems to really think about how this is translated into practice. And so one of the things I hope people will think about, particularly in the behavioral health space, is how we look to the leadership of DBH and CBH to think about you not having to do that alone, right? How we create a community practice that's thinking about how your therapeutic approaches connect to this and what needs to be added to it, and how it needs to be built into staff development systems, and how it needs to be adjusted in your budget, all those kinds of things, so that you're beginning this process today. You're leaders in this system that we want you to take us to the table and say, okay, good, how are we going to deepen this work? We also have a conversation with our school time folks. They don't have the same kind of infrastructure to do that kind of PV and planning, and we want to work with them to build that. But we're also here because there's an exciting partnership with the school district that Flourish Agenda is embarking on. And so Dr. Banks is going to tell you a little bit about that to wrap this up.
Yeah, but I want to make sure you're aware of what's going down.
Can you move?
Can you use the microphone?
Oh,
Please, thanks.
I'm not. Okay, better? Yeah, all right. So we are partnering with Flourish Agenda to bring this to Philly, okay? And so what does that mean? We are identifying 15 schools where a cohort of adults, same-sex adults, will engage in the healing-centered certification training. I'm telling my school leaders, I just don't want to see where you're on the list, okay? I want to see instructional, non-instructional. I want to see your partners. I want to see your parents, ones that are involved, or maybe ones that haven't found a way to be involved yet, right? I want to see, those important people to your school community involved in this. We are also bringing Camp Achilles to Philadelphia. And, woohoo! Yeah. And so in July, with our lovely partners who are here in the row at Jackson University, we are going to host Camp Achille in Philly. And so kids from those schools will then get to have their own healing experience. So in the fall, we're going to have adults in a building and kids in a building that we want to then bring together, think about what does it mean for us, what does it mean for our community, and it's not going to be pushed from like a 440 agenda or whatever, it's their community, and they get to speak to what it means to them in their community. So that's where we're going. And that's why I said, and I started with saying that I really want the community members in the building to be a part of this, so that, we can all do this together.